Welcome to The Leader Speaks, a webinar presented by Bluepoint Leadership Development. My name is Julie Henry, and today it's my pleasure to introduce you to Gregg Thompson, President of Bluepoint Leadership Development. Gregg is a facilitator, coach, and speaker with a passion for developing the greatness in individuals and organizations. He is the co-author of 3 books, The Power to Lead, The Leadership Experience, and Unleashed. Welcome, Gregg. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks, Julie. I'm thrilled to be here and delighted to be leading this workshop today. I understand we have a rather large group on the call today, so I'm honored to be part of this discussion. When we look at this idea of the leader speaking, we really are exploring the idea about how one can get their voice heard in an organization, and not only have it heard, but have it make a difference. At the very core, leadership communication is one of the most important facets and aspects of leadership. If you look at all the things leaders attend to and do within the organization, communication is fundamental to all of these. And we'll explore this a little bit further here today. So I'm thrilled to be here. I expect that we'll speak for about 30 minutes or so, 35 minutes. And my hope is that I can stimulate some ideas and thinking about how you can make a bigger impact and difference in your organization. The young girl on the screen, her name is Julianne, and she's the daughter of one of our senior workshop facilitators. And her mother shared this story with me recently. Is that Julianne came to her and says, you know, that when people talk a lot, it's really hard for me to get heard. And so what I do is I just turn my talk up. Think about this. I just turn my talk up. And really, this is what we do in organizations. It's almost endemic in organizations because of the complexity and chaos in organizations these days, is that when leaders aren't heard, they just simply talk louder. And there's more, and they fill the air with words and talk and meetings and emails, and essentially they are doing what Julianne does. She simply turns her talk up. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, and unfortunately, they're simply not heard. Before we go much farther, I'd like to just address 3 big myths about communication, about this area of communication, especially as it impacts leadership. The first one, and maybe surprising, is the myth that communication is a very important leadership competency. Quite frankly, it shows up near the top of every competency list of every major corporation that I've ever worked with. I would argue, however, that it's not a leadership competency. Communication is your leadership. When we think of it as a competency, we put it up there with strategic thinking, project management, teamwork, all important things. But communication to the leader is his or her leadership. I love this quote from James Humes. Every time you speak, you are auditioning for leadership. So in every email you write, in every hallway conversation, in every meeting, in every presentation, you're auditioning for leadership, which means you're auditioning to make an impact on others. So I really encourage you to be thinking about communication as something different than a competency, something so aligned to the idea of leadership that it in fact is leadership itself. Myth number 2 is that people need more and better information. You know, in this day with emails and videos and mass communications and social networking and the like, people do not need more information. What they need is more meaning, more purpose. What they need is information that makes an impact on them, that causes them to be different in some way. The idea somehow that we simply need to get more information out to people is a futile effort. There's tons of information out there. The third myth is this, is that the challenge, the core challenge for the leader is to get a clear, consistent message to everyone. How many times have you not sat in a meeting or listened to a leader or manager or senior executive say this? If we could simply get our message out there, if we could simply craft our message, our position, our strategy way that everybody received it the same way, that would be our communication task. It really is not. The reason being is that leaders are held to a higher standard. Our job is not simply informing people. It's not. Our job as leaders is to communicate in a way that gets people to think and act together, gets people to think and act differently. So it's not about informing. It's not about engaging. It's not about entertaining. Everybody else is held to that standard. As a leader, we're held to only one standard. Do people think and act differently because of what we say? And I must tell you, this is not easy. What we try to do is simply to do more of it, and comes across many times to our constituents as simply more volume. Think about the organization. We like to use this painting on the screen now called intersection as a metaphor for the challenge of leadership communication. You, as a leader, this is what you wake up to every morning. Consider this to be a metaphor for your organization. Consider the complexity, the individuality, the fragmentation, the differing agendas, values, beliefs, pursuits. These folks are not evil. They are not bad. The people that we're communicating to, our constituents, simply are human with their own aspirations, motives, and they're hearing what they hear. And so when you look at the idea of leadership communication, our challenge is simply this. When we look out this messy, complex, chaotic thing called an organization, can we make things different? Do things, are people more aligned? Alignment is huge these days. Are people more committed? Are they all driving for the same goal? Are people naturally engaged? Do people bring their best work to the job every day? Their discretionary talents, their best energies. Are people deeply committed? Are they? Do they stop at the first roadblock, or will they bob and weave and move around it? This here is the measure of leadership. So how can one get heard? How can one be heard within the organization? It's really interesting. I would challenge you to start listening to people in the organization who really make an impact. Listen to those managers and leaders that when they speak, when they write an email, when they have a hallway conversation, when they chair a meeting, when they speak out on any issue, people stop and listen and think and act differently. We call it the TLS model. That's an acronym for the Leader Speaks model. And I'd like to share the principles of this model with you today. And as you're thinking and looking at considering this model, I would really encourage you to think about examples you have in your organization where men and women show up and communicate using these principles. They would never be formally introduced to this model, but they naturally use these principles. And because they do, we listen to them and we hear them, then their voice makes a difference. At the core is this idea of a place to stand. Leaders who make an impact in organizations are distinctive in some way. They have an agenda. They have a position. They have a set of principles, values, beliefs from which all of their communications flow. They also recognize that all communication is personal. Whether or not you're ordering office supplies or talking corporate strategy, all communication is personal. Then next, one of the things that distinguishes a leader's communication is it always has the element of future. It always is in some way talking about a future and drawing people towards a future. And then lastly, it's always a story. It's either using stories as examples, stories as metaphors, or the communication itself is a story. As we'll talk about a little bit later, one of the things the neuroscientists all agree upon these days is that the only way that we as humans can think, can put things together, can understand how other people are speaking is through the idea of story, because we all have these stories playing out in our own minds. So let's look at each of these just briefly. First of all is this idea of a place to stand. You know, you probably I can remember a time when you've communicated at your very best, when you really felt packed, you had great confidence. It almost always is when you're standing on a rock. When you're at a place where you really believe that the foundation you're standing on, the principles, the values are worthy. And when we come from that place, even if we have the quietest voice, even if we're introverted, even if we are naturally shy, that's when we're able to speak with confidence and say the pointed things that need to be said. I love this quote from Archimedes. Give me a lever long enough and a place to stand, and I will move the world. So think about this. Give me a lever long enough and a place to stand, and I will move the world. And so what Archimedes was saying, the leverage, that can be his thinking, his ideas, the content of what he has to say. But give me a place to stand. Give me a set of principles. Give me a set of beliefs. And this is what will allow me to really take action, to really make things happen. I love this image. Content is crucial. I believe that we are very transparent. I believe even in this moment, as you're listening to me, you're thinking, does he believe this? What does he really think about leadership? Is what he is saying truly important to him? We all do this. We do this instinctively. We do this naturally. I would like to remind you that the next time you speak, people are asking them the same questions about you. What they're asking you is this. Asking about you is this. Is what do you stand for? What is important to you? What does this person really believe in? So what are your core leadership principles? My encouragement to you, take a little bit of quiet time and write those down. Most of us have 4 to 5 things that are core principles that really are the items and beliefs and values from which all of our communication emanates. My encouragement to you would become clear on what those are. The next aspect of communication is personal. All communication is personal. We are not really able to communicate in any other way. There's a great quote from Antonio Damasio when he speaks about this idea of personal connection. And he says, reason without emotion is neurologically impossible. Reason without emotion is neurologically impossible. What he was saying was, there's no way that we can connect and think about something with our cognitive side without having an emotional element to that as well. What that means for our listeners is that unless we can connect with them on the emotional channel, on the emotional element, unless they can feel it to some degree, they can't think it. In this very moment, I'm either touching you personally or I'm not. You're either allowing me to be important on this call or you're not. And that is not done solely through the cognitive part of your brain. It is through the emotional part of your brain. If I can't get you to think that this is important to me and that this needs to be important to you, you will not let it be important to you. And it is only through that emotional connection can I help you make that happen. It's really interesting. If you look at most of the leadership communication programs, there's always any kind of communication program, sales programs, leadership programs, there's always a big element in there about knowing your audience. There's big chapters in there. You need to know your audience. Now, I don't diminish or discount the value of that. I think that's important. However, to make a true personal connection, I believe what you need to do is speak about what's really important to you. This is not about being egotistical, and this is not about being self-centered. This is really about speaking from that passion about the things that are most important to you. It's much more important that we know what's important to you than you know what's important to us. Think about it. Once I know what's really important to you, I'm going to help you know what's really important to me. I love this quote from Steve Jobs. I want to make a dent in the universe. I want to make a dent in the universe. Think about that quote. As soon as we see that, we read that quote, we get this personal connection with Steve Jobs, because that really lets us know what is important to him at a core level. Here's one of the biggest problems with leaders today in terms of their communication. They don't know what's important to them anymore. They have spent so long spinning it. They have spent so much energy in crafting the ideal corporate kind of communication that is devoid of the personal element, that they have a hard time finding out what is really important to them. I'm an executive leadership coach, and a lot of my coaching, especially early on in my coaching assignments, is simply to help remind people, to help them rediscover what's most important to them. There's a great quote from Rofer Chalad. We are so accustomed to disguise ourselves to others that in the end, we become disguised to ourselves. We become disguised to ourselves. The next element of communication on the TLS model, the Leader Speaks model, is this idea of the future. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that really distinguishes and the hallmark of a leader's communication is there's always an element of the future. Always an element of the future in that communication in some way. Be thinking about this in your communication. What does your communication point towards? One of my working definitions of leadership these days, and one of the definitions I think really brings meaning to this idea of leadership communication is this. Leadership, at its very core, leadership, is an invitation to a tomorrow that is better than today. When we look at our role as leaders, are we the kind of men and women that as we go through the organization on a day-to-day basis, as we meet with our teams, as we meet with our staff, as we meet with our colleagues, as we meet with our managers, are we always presenting in some way an invitation to a tomorrow that is better than today? This is indeed the hallmark of the leader's communication. I'm going to ask you just to stop for a moment and think about your organization. Think about your team. Think about your organization. And write down 4 or 5 words. Just grab a piece of paper somewhere. Write down 4 or 5 words that you would use to describe a compelling future for your organization. It might have something to do with adventure. It might have something to do with innovation. It might have something to do with some daring discovery. It might have something to do with your own personal passions or those of the people that you serve. So you think, what are those words that really describe this most compelling future? So as you write those words, my challenge to you is this, is how often do you actually use those words? How often do you talk about those things that are most compelling about the future for your team and your organization? And I'm not talking just about your formal presentations, but in your day-to-day language, because it's in the day-to-day language when people really understand what is important to us as leaders. The next element of the TLS model, the Leader Speaks model, is the idea of story. Story is at the core of all great communication. Story. My guess is every person on this call at some time has been involved in a great project. When you've been really at your best on a wonderful team with a great piece of work, you accomplished really some remarkable things. You look back on it now and you say, "Man, that was just wonderful work." My guess is that somewhere in that system, there was a leader who crafted a great story, or helped you craft a great story. Helped craft a story that said you were on a great journey, on a great adventure. You overcame a great odds. And this is the important piece, and this leader helped you find a starring role. Because the great leaders have always done this for us. They not only help articulate and bring alive the team story, the organization story, but they let us connect our story to that. Whether or not we're the receptionist or the CEO, they help us find starring roles in that story. Storytelling and being part of story is essentially being human. I love this quote from Denison. To be a person is to have a story to tell. What he is saying, he's really equating the idea of humanity, the idea of humans existing in society, existing in organizations, existing in relationship to others, is to have a story to tell. Now again, the great leaders recognize this and help other people connect their stories with the organizational story. If you look at this on the whole grand time scale of humans, from the time we scratched pictures of antelope on cave walls to the next time you sit in a conference room and look at a PowerPoint presentation, we really are looking at creating and talking about stories. It is the nature of humans to engage in and communicate around a story. So what I want you to do is even to think about, what's your story? Think about the stories that you have been part of in your own life, in your career, and in your organization, in your team, in your experience as a manager, a leader, whatever that might be. I'm going to put up a few examples on the screen just to stimulate your own thinking. Was there a time in your life, in your career, where you slayed a dragon? Now, for many of us, when we look at that, we know exactly when that happened. We knew when that came to life. We knew when that incident or event occurred for us. Did you have a deep, dark time? Was there a time when you felt like you were really turned into a frog? For many of us, we know what that story is. When have you won enormous treasure? When have you killed a golden goose? When do you look back in your career and say, you know, I would have done it differently. I exploited that situation, and because of that, I lost the golden goose. When have you rescued a damsel or a prince? When have you encountered the big bad wolf? This is a classic story. And of course, I've used a number of fables and references to fables and story tales in this exercise. But the reason for doing that is to illustrate to you how quickly we can think via stories, how quickly we can remember via stories, how important these stories make an impact in our own perception of our history and our experiences. So I would like to also share 3 what we call communication power tools with you, ways and methods and processes and approaches that you can use to really lift the impact of your communication. The first one is the power tool of language. Quite frankly, leaders speak a different language. They do. They use words that make a different kind of impact. They don't try to simply inform or entertain. They use language that injects tension into the system, tension into the team, positive tension, creative tension. They evoke emotion. They seek to connect with a person's emotional side and actually evoke emotion, and they want to spur action. So next time you listen to a leader that you really believe is a great communicator, listen for the language that they use. They tend to use different kinds of language. And it's not a lot of words. It's the right words. Love this quote from Mark Twain. I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead. I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead. Ernest Hemingway took this even further, and you may have heard of this story. He was involved in a wager with a journalist in a bar. I assume a few beer were involved. And his task from the journalist was to write a very, very short story. And as you probably know, that Ernest Hemingway was really renowned for the quality of his short story. And they somehow agreed on 6 words. The story goes that he came back the next day with this story. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. Powerful story. In 6 words. It is the potency of those words. I was in search of a briefcase or a bag here about a year ago, and I came across Saddleback Leather Company. And I want to draw your attention to some of the language that they use and how this language really evokes attention, injects tension, and actually caused me to buy this bag. There's all kinds of language, marketing language out there that is used heavily. But how many people talk about your descendants? And if you look at the bottom part of this slide, it says, if you or one of your descendants should have a problem, send it back to me or one of my descendants, and we'll repair or replace it for free. They also say, be sure to mention the warranty in your will. For a briefcase, mention the warranty in your will. This is the one that got me. They'll fight over it when you're dead. They'll fight over it when you're dead. This is the language that gets your attention. I would really encourage you to think about this, particularly in your written communication. The next time you write an email, think about it from the perspective of the person reading it. And what language are you using that really will make an impact, that will really be distinctive, that will really evoke emotion, that will really spur some action in some way? The second power tool is the power tool of imagery. If you look at this idea of imagery, and that includes everything from metaphors to color to stories to poems, it is this whole idea that images are the way that humans think. And so when we use images in our communication, we are using a direct line into the way that humans think. I'll take you back to one of the very first slides I used was a picture, a representation of a painting. The painting was called Intersection. And I was using that as a metaphor for organizations today. The reason I was using that imagery is because I know that imagery speaks loudly to people. If I drew an organization chart with squares and boxes and lines, this would not resonate, would not speak to you like that imagery. So leaders do not use imagery to simply enliven their communication, but to rather to convey the deepest and most significant messages. If I was to come here and speak to you today and talk to you about HIV, and I was going to share some information, some of the data with you, and I use this slide. It's a well laid out slide. 90% of all HIV infections are in sub-Saharan Africa. You will get it. You'll get the information. However, if I start to use more imagery and I show you an image of the enemy itself, and I came here and I said HIV, 90% of all HIV infections are in sub-Saharan Africa, you start to get the message. This starts to have an impact because you can see the enemy. But what if I came here today and I simply gave you this image? 90% of all HIV infections are in sub-Saharan Africa. I don't need to say much more. This image touches us at the deepest level. This image carries a profound message. The third power tool is the power tool of argument. Probably it's the power tool that is the most misunderstood, because when we think about this idea of argument, the very first thing we think about is really an argument. And it's not about having an argument. It's about having argument, point of view, strong argument, point of view in what you have to communicate. If you just take argument as a fight, you probably find this quote from Dave Barry quite interesting. I love this. I can win an argument on any topic against my opponent. People know this and steer clear of me at parties. Often, as a sign of their great respect, they don't even invite me. Now, I find this quite humorous, but I assure you this is not what I mean when I use the term argument. I don't mean this kind of argument. I mean having a great point of view, well supported. I believe people are looking to draw a logical thread through everything you say. Great leader communicators don't just stand up and wave their arms and use blustery terms. They have a point of view. It is well thought out. It is well reasoned. It is well supported by options and alternatives, evidence. Great leaders understand that we need to make connections. We need to have evidence. We need to see pros and cons. We need to see consequences. We even need to be introduced, and the dilemmas that we have with an issue need to be recognized as well. Love this quote. A fact is like a sack. It won't stand up if it is empty. To make it stand up, first you have to put in all the reasons and feelings that caused it in the first place. I would encourage you to think about this idea. I call it a point of view, having a point of view. How many times have you heard an eloquent speaker, you're interested, it's engaging, it's probably funny, and then you say, well, what was this person really saying? And if we leave the audience struggling, then we are not doing our job as a leader. And I also believe that it's not just that we don't know what to say. I think sometimes we simply don't want to say it. I believe that we say thousands of unimportant things because often we lack the courage to say the one most important thing. If you look at a leader whose communication really impacts you, I believe that every time you will see and be able to draw this logical thread through this person's communication and also be very clear on what their point of view is. As we close, I'd like to challenge you to be thinking about this idea of leadership communication with this idea. Picture your listeners with a remote control in their hands. They can shut you off at any point. This is the one thing we don't have control of as leaders and as communicators. We can be speaking to one person or 1,000 people, and they at any time can simply shut the remote control off. We can talk away, they can look engaged, they can nod their head knowingly, but they are the ones with their fingers on the remote control button. Are we speaking in a way that comes from a strong place on which we stand? Are we able to make a personal connection with them? Do we talk about a future that is so engaging they want to actually come with us? And are we able to put this together into a story, into a way of communicating and thinking that naturally connects with the way that they think? My encouragement to you is to start looking at communication through a different lens. Stop simply trying to turn your talk up, because you can't do it. You are probably competing with 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 voices every day in the organization. We call it the noisy organization. So how can you have your voice heard above the din of all that noise? How can you be the one that people will listen to, will not only hear, but will think differently and act differently because of what you have to say? One way of looking at organizations is this: a fog-bound road. Many of our organizations are fog-bound these days. It's just the nature of change and the dynamic environments we live in, the changing marketplaces and technology, that fog is often coming closer and closer to us as we go down the road of the organization or with our team. The challenge for us is this: as leaders, are we able to blow that fog away? Are we able to provide the direction that will have people looking way down the road? Do people want to harness all their energy and action so that they will be able to drive down that road and be part of something bigger than themselves? One of the ways that we know we can blow this fog out of the organization is by having that kind of communication that really makes an impact and makes a difference in organizations. I was honored to have this time with you, and I thank you for your attention. It was great to spend this time, especially with such a large group on the call here today. I would like to invite your comments, your questions. I would be delighted to correspond with you on the whole idea of leadership and leadership communication. It is a passion of mine. If you have some ideas, some thoughts, some questions, please email me. My email is on the screen now, and I'd be thrilled to take any of your emails or calls.